Hello and welcome to Cognitive Explanations for Depression, Psychopathology, Individual Differences. So in this session we're going to look at the different cognitive explanations for why we develop depression, and we're going to evaluate these theories in terms of how reliable they are at explaining depression. So first, let's have a look at some clinical characteristics of depression. So the DSM actually characterizes depression, now clinical depression, as major depressive disorder. This is likely a response to the relatively common use of the word depression in everyday language, which often when we say we're feeling depressed, we're not referring to having clinical depression, and therefore it can be helpful to identify it as something different. We can categorize the symptoms as being emotional, behavioral, or cognitive. In this case, behavioral symptoms such as reduced activity, productivity, low appetite, speaking and moving less, and so forth. Cognitive symptoms such as negative views of self and feelings of helplessness. Now, if we just have a look at the DSM criteria, they are very specific, and we're not just talking about the sort of symptoms that you and I may face every single week. Depressed mood and irritable most of the day, nearly every day. Now, I would say most of us are irritable at some point, perhaps even at a single point every day, but it's more this sustained irritability. Significant weight change, 5%. So it's putting a sort of number on it. Our weight fluctuates all the time, but if you go for rapid weight loss or gain, this could be a result of depression. Fatigue, loss of energy, guilt, worthlessness, and then we can go down and see how these criteria are applied. So it is a very broad but also fairly significant psychological disorder. It's probably the most common psychological disorder faced by people. How do we measure depression? Well, we've got two scales, the Hamilton Rating Scale for Depression and Beck's Depression Inventory. There are many more, but I picked these two out specifically. The Hamilton scale was very popular some decades ago, and interesting, Ben Goldacre in his book Bad Science highlights some of the issues around how drug companies often publish their results. What was interesting is the early SSRI research, and in fact even today, they often use this Hamilton Rating Scale for depression. And one of the downsides of this scale, as you can see, is that there are many of these points that you and I will probably score quite high on. However, there are also issues that someone with depression will face that are not currently on the scale. So some researchers argue a superior inventory is Beck's Depression Inventory. These inventories are well worth having a go at. Don't take them with a pinch of salt. You need a professional to diagnose you with depression, but to get a feel of the sort of questions that they ask the patients. So that's essentially how we measure depression. The first theory we're going to look at then is Beck's negative triad. And the idea here is that we have these reinforcing relationship between thoughts, behaviours and emotions, which can escalate, causing depression to essentially increase. Depression is, we often talk about onset of depression, but actually it's more of a scale or a spectrum, really, that you can suffer more severe depression or less severe depression. So let's take each of these elements. Let's take views about the world. This is you projecting onto the world your beliefs. And you may have beliefs such as everything is against me. I'm never going to succeed in the world because the world is just rigged against me. Negative views about self, I'm worthless. And negative views about the future, nothing is ever going to change. Now, if we take all three of these elements together, you can see how they feed each other. So let's say you start off with the view that you're worthless, okay? And you're worthless, and on top of that, everything is against you. So no matter how hard you try, it doesn't matter because the world is rigged. The system's rigged. And what's more is it's always going to be rigged. And you can see how this would lead to behaviours such as a loss of energy and motivation, but also failure to even get up in the morning. If I thought that I was worthless, number one, and that the world was systematically against me, was rigged against me, and that it was never going to change, I'm not sure I would get out of bed in the morning. So you can see how these are all feed into each other here. Key to the cognitive approach to explain depression is this idea of schemas. And negative schemas can develop from negative events. They can be a specific event or a chain of events. Now, schemas regarding the competence, for example, might result from a particular task that you perform badly. Perhaps you answer a question at school, you give a silly answer, whatever, and your teacher says, "Oh, that's a ridiculous answer." That one event can develop a negative schema about your competence in a subject. And I remember a friend of mine once telling me a story about studying in English, and he wrote this poem and he thought it was a really good poem, and they submitted it, and the teacher accused him of plagiarising it because it was really good. And as a result, he developed this sort of negative schema that he wasn't good at English. So, and that would have been self-reinforcing later. The negative schema can then be triggered in any situation. Consider another, say, different example. Schema that you score badly in the maths test, you develop this idea that you're not very good at maths. Well, the negative schema will be triggered in any situation that requires you to do maths. And you can see how all sorts of negative behaviours may occur where you're not, you're shortchanged, but you don't challenge it because you're not confident in your own abilities. Now, remember that a schema is a shortcut. If we have to analyse every situation that we come across completely from scratch, every time we see a tiger, we have to learn from scratch. It's got fur, it's got whiskers, blah, 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 da-da-da, should I run, should I not? Every single time. We wouldn't survive very long as a species. So schemas help us as a sort of cognitive time saver. And instead of a negative schema, a negative schema is just going to pop out as that quick shortcut to explain why we behaved in a particular situation and why something happened to us. Continued negative events or perceived negative events can strengthen the schema over time. So, some examples of negative schemata. Well, Beck argues that these are basic cognitive biases. So, overgeneralization is a common one. We make these general conclusions about single events. I am unlucky because once I was unlucky, or a common one is I never win anything. Personalization, when someone else is upset, you assume that it's because of you or related to you in some way. Minimization, you underplay your own successes. The exam paper was really easy, it was just a fluke. I don't even know how I passed. Magnification, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone. And selective abstraction, so focusing on the negative and ignoring the positive. You get an A in the test but you fail one question, that suggests that you are selectively abstracting. Types of schema, there are 3 different types of schema that you may be employing. We've got the sociotropic. Sociotropy is a personality trait characterized by excessive investment in relationships and obsession to some extent. People with this type of negative schema believe they're constantly failing in their relationships. So they're the partner that's making the other partner miserable. Autonomous, this is where you have an overemphasis on personal achievement and social rank, and if you have these sort of categorical I must do well, you may irrationally judge yourself against your peers, or believe that your personal achievement isn't particularly good despite evidence, and you may be overly self-critical by having distorted perceptions of your own shortcomings. So that's Beck. Now we're going to look at Ellis's ABC model, a different model of depression. So this one is focused almost entirely on irrational thinking. And the idea here is that by challenging our rational beliefs, we can change the outcome of events. So Ellis argues that events are not necessarily stressful in themselves. So if you suffer a setback at work or someone says something mean to you, that is not the cause of stress. The cause of stress is our belief about that activating event and the consequences from it. So we all have goals, according to Ellis, pursuit of happiness and so forth, and there are certain blocks, many of which are just natural barriers that prevent us from achieving our goals in life. And they can be things like illness, or they can be, life circumstances or whatever. However, our reaction to these blocks can be rational or irrational. If they are irrational, Ellis says, then this can cause emotions such as depression and lead to negative consequences. A key figure is Mustabatory thinking. So the focus here is that people with Mustabatory thinking have some irrational beliefs, like I must be approved of by important people, so you seek approval desperately. I must do well or else I'm worthless. I've had students who said, they've got 90% in a test and they're disappointed with that because they feel they should have got 95, Perhaps they're not thinking that they're worthless, but they're not recognising their own achievement. And the belief that the world must be fair and give you happiness, this is a form of Mustabatory thinking. And all of these are essentially false. And the key is going to be getting the individual to challenge those thoughts and change it. Just going back to the activating belief, it is at the belief stage that Ellis believes we have most control, and that by changing this belief, by challenging those irrational beliefs, those Mustabatory beliefs, we can improve the consequences and outcomes. Okay, so are these theories worth their weight? Lloyd and Lishman asked participants to recall negative or positive experiences based on a stimulus word. They did find that people suffering from depression were much quicker at recalling negative experiences and memories than positive ones. And you can measure this in time. Hammond and Krantz, 1976, found that depressed women made more errors when they were given a scenario involving a woman and events that happened to them. They made more logical errors than women who were not depressed. Now, what these two studies show is cognitive bias and irrational thinking. Our capacity for rational thinking is impaired when we're depressed. Now, this leads to an interesting question. Does depression cause irrational thinking, or does irrational thinking cause depression? In truth, we just don't know. Irrational thinking could be a symptom or consequence of suffering from depression, in the same way that attention deficit is a result of lack of sleep. So it could be that the sort of neurological changes that occur during the onset of depression may have this impact on rational versus irrational thinking. A strength of the cognitive approach is that it does recognise agency, and it provides a positive view of mental health rather than mental illness. So it puts the patient or client in the driving seat. It says you are strong enough to change your own mind, and that's quite positive. If you imagine a behaviourist trying to explain depression, they would say that it's just learned responses, and they would try to train you out of depression in the same way you train a dog to balance a treat, and that's quite a negative view of humans, that we're just subject to forces that happen to us, whereas cognitive approach is much more positive. Further evaluations, not all negative beliefs are irrational. So Alloy and Abramson found that some people who were classified as depressive realists were very good at predicting the likelihood of disaster. Now this shows that some negative thinking may actually have an adaptive function, and make you more suitable to certain environments or jobs. And one of the strongest criticisms of the cognitive explanation is that to some extent it ignores the biological explanations for depression. So the role of neurotransmitters, genes and so forth. Research, for example, has shown a high concordance rate, 76%, amongst monozygotic twins, those are identical twins, for the onset of depression. Now that is strong evidence for a genetic relationship. However, when you look at fraternal twins, it's much lower in the 20%. So whilst genetics is influenced, perhaps environment is still hugely important. The other explanation is that the role of serotonin and SSRIs, which have been relatively successful at treating depression, if drugs that rely on a biological model are effective at treating depression, then that suggests that some aspect of the depression is at least has a biological cause, and the cognitive approach is largely ignoring this. As with all things, the combined approach is probably the most effective, and we'll look at effective treatments next time. Now finally, there is evidence for sociotropy and depression. Sato and McCann found that this was a precursor to developing depression. So there's some evidence for that. As always, if you have any questions, please do ask. Otherwise, I hope you found it helpful, and I will see you next time.